We're going to start out by watching a PSL video from the campaign, which was just released today on LGBT issues. I think it kind of will dovetail very nicely with the report that Antoinette gave. It really shows the struggle that we're going to bring to the electoral process. So we'll do that, and then I'll come back.
My name is Steve Kelly, and I'm voting for Peter Lindsay and Johnny Osario for the Party for Socialism and Liberation in this year's presidential election. Why? First of all, it is a fact that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are going to do what it takes for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people to have what we need: full federal equality immediately. Each of the two big parties, supporters of profits over people's needs, refuse to endorse a federal mandate upholding full marriage rights for same-sex couples. The Employment Non-Discrimination Act still has not passed, and so in 29 states it is legal to fire someone because they are lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And in 34 states it is legal to fire someone for being transgender. Despite major gains in the legal arena in several states, we are facing an epidemic of suicides and violent attacks. We cannot afford to wait for equality. Peter Lindsay and Johnny Osario stand for full federal equality for LGBT people, and they believe the time for these rights is now. Our campaign calls for unity and solidarity from all working class and progressive people against the bigotry and lies of the right-wing hate mongers who promote violence against the community, especially transgender people and LGBT youth. President Obama's recent announcement that he now personally supports equal marriage rights for same-sex couples is historic and is a partial victory for the struggle. But it falls short of taking any real action to combat the ongoing tide of bigotry and uphold the rights of states to discriminate. This is not okay. Also, recent court decisions that the Defense of Marriage Act and Prop 8 in California violate the rights of same-sex couples to marry are encouraging and important. We cannot forget that these important gains reflect the growing support brought about by decades of militant mass struggle. It is outrageous how bigotry and hatred are being promoted daily in the big business media. Millions of dollars funding right-wing hate speech are being poured into this year's election in an effort to push back the struggle for LGBT equality. Both Democrats and Republicans represent the interests of the capitalist class. While millions of workers are losing their homes, their jobs, and access to health care, the big business parties champion a system based on profits rather than the needs of poor and working people. The 1% relies on racism, sexism, and LGBT bigotry to weaken and divide the working class. But the tide is turning in favor of civil rights. Support from many political figures and organizations such as the NAACP clearly show this. That is why the struggle must intensify and not wait for Democrats to act. We know our history. The Stonewall Rebellion that took place in 1969, where LGBT people fought back against police terror, launched a mass movement for liberation and poured into the streets in cities and towns all across the country. We have made history fighting the good fight. If we wait for the Democratic Party to give us full equality, we'll wait forever. The rights we have won were not gifts from the politicians, but rather the result of the movement we have built to demand full equality for all. The facts are simple. Change comes from people. Without struggle, nothing changes. Unlike other candidates, Peter Lindsay and Johnny Osario are militant defenders of LGBT rights. They have been in the streets side by side with the LGBT people and their supporters. If you believe that same-sex marriage should be a federal right, if you believe job discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender expression should be illegal, then join me in voting for the candidates from the Party for Socialism and Liberation, Peter Lindsay and Johnny Osario. It is time to break with the past and move forward to a future where racism, sexism, and all forms of bigotry are a thing of the past. Join us. Vote PSL.
So I would encourage everybody to help us go viral with that great video to the best that we can and make 2012 a distant memory. So in 1960, consensual sex between two men or two women was considered a criminal act everywhere in this country. And in many places it was a felony crime, which meant you spent at least 1 year in state prison. When I was a young child in the 1960s, same-sex love was considered a mental illness. The standard cure at the time was electric shock therapy. It was only in 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association declassified queer love as a mental disorder. It was less than 25 years ago, in 1990, that the World Health Organization declassified homosexuality as a mental illness. And it wasn't until 2003 when the Supreme Court overturned the Texas sodomy law in Lawrence v. Texas decision, and by extension, invalidated the existing 13 sodomy laws in other states, that same-sex sexual activity was no longer a crime in the United States. Now, in February of this year, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed that California's Proposition 8 is unconstitutional, and unless it's appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, same-sex marriages will be legal again in California. And as the video showed and Antoinette talked about, just about 6 weeks ago, President Obama, speaking personally, not for the Democratic Party, expressed support for marriage equality for same-sex couples. And lastly, at the end of May, there was a significant decision that was also referenced by the earlier speakers, that the U.S. State Court of Appeal for the First Circuit ruled unanimously that certain parts of the DOMA law was discriminatory and unconstitutional. And I think more importantly, there's a recent CNN poll conducted on June 6th that found that 54% of the people interviewed, when asked the following question, and this is important: do you think marriages between gay and lesbian couples should or should not be recognized by the law as valid with the same rights as traditional marriages? 54% said yes. Almost 75% of those aged 18 to 39 said yes, and 60% of people of color also said yes. All these numbers represent increases from 1, 3, or 5 years ago. Also this year, a reactionary anti-gay legislation has been passed or put on the ballot. In North Carolina, Amendment 1 was passed, changing the state constitution to affirm marriage as between solely a man and a woman. The amendment goes so far as to ban civil unions or domestic partnerships for all unmarried couples, straight, same or opposite sex. The amendment received 60% of the vote. Minnesota and Washington states have anti-same-sex marriage referendums on the ballot for November. Now, what happened between 1960, when my love for another man, or the happiness that two women would find in each other's passion, went from a felony crime to last month, a love endorsed by a standing president of the United States? How do we as Marxists explain the contradiction between the victory for bigotry in North Carolina and the sentiment reflected in the CNN poll? Well, it's explained by the efforts of the ruling class, to enforce their institutional and structural lesbian gay oppression and bigotry and exploitation, in opposition to the values and beliefs the majority of the people, the working class, hold. Values that reflect the impact of the struggle for equality, but combined with how much society and the family has changed since the middle of the 20th century. The struggle of the LGBT community, with its allies in the working class, fighting for unity against anti-LGBT bigotry, sexism, and racism, has played a large part in changing views on homosexuality and bringing about this latest majority view of people in favor of marriage equality. What got the American Psychiatric Association to declassify homosexuality as a mental illness was not new research or some wonderful academic paper. It was the Stonewall Rebellion and the birth of the modern liberation LGBT movement. It was no coincidence that Stonewall happened at the height of the Civil Rights Movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, and on the cusp of the Women's Liberation Movement. The period of the 60s and 70s was one of great social and economic and political change. It was the protests and disruptions at the APA offices and their annual meetings from 1970 to 1973 that brought about enlightenment from these great psychiatric professionals. It was the oppressed saying, "No more will you victimize us. We have come out of the closet, we are not going back." It was the millions who marched, rallied, and rebelled against bigotry, police violence, insults, inequality, and hatred, which got anti-discrimination laws passed, protecting us all across the country. It was the national marches of millions in 1979, 1987, and 1993 that flooded Washington, D.C., demanding full civil rights that laid the basis for the recent gains made around marriage equality. It was the hundreds of thousands of AIDS activists who took over the office of the FDA and the countless drug companies demanding compassionate release of drugs to treat AIDS, who occupied hospitals when gay men were denied the right to see their dying lover because they were not family. These actions exposed the callous nature of the healthcare system and touched the core of millions of straight people who had experienced the death of a loved one. The AIDS epidemic revealed the level of cruelty and human indifference LGBT people suffered at the hands of the healthcare system, a system that doles out indifference to millions of workers, regardless of sexual orientation. This struggle had a huge impact on the consciousness of the working class in this country. Also contributing to the advances for marriage equality is a change in the composition and character of U.S. society over the last 50 years. This change has led to a more diverse and heterogeneous society. And ironically, I think this is part of a result of a ruling class campaign to accumulate greater profits through increasing exploitation of the working class both here in the U.S. and around the world. At the beginning of the 1960s, the vast majority of working class families could be supported by a single wage earner, which in most cases were men. Women stayed home and raised the children and took care of family life, cooking, cleaning, and shopping. People weren't that mobile, with most people living their lives where they grew up or nearby. While black men were paid less as a consequence of racism, and black women worked outside the home, primarily as domestic workers, maybe at a higher rate than white women, overall, the single wage earning male family was kind of the status quo. I remember as a young child in the early 1960s, growing up in a multinational working class neighborhood in New York City, going to the supermarket with my mom, and the only men in the store were the workers who held the male jobs of manager, butcher, and stocker. Some women were cashiers, but that was the exception. There were no men shopping for groceries. There was very little variation in family life from this model. For lesbian gay people, it was very difficult, if not dangerous, to try and live openly. Starting in the mid-70s and up through the 80s, there was a massive assault on the living standards of the working class in the United States. As a result, it was no longer possible for a family to survive on the income of a single male wage earner. Millions of women entered the workforce and were paid less than men and segregated to certain jobs. As a consequence of millions of women leaving the home and working and playing a more active role in society, all kinds of values and beliefs were challenged. Those with sexist ideas were either forced to change or at least be silent. Views on the roles of women and men were undergoing a profound change, and this had an impact on the view of gender, sex, and sexual orientation. These changes in views and values about women were happening at the same time that the struggles of nationally oppressed people were making a similar impact on society, its institutions, and its values. As a consequence of the genocidal wars sponsored by U.S. imperialism in Central America and the destruction of national economies by IMF structural adjustment programs, and later by NAFTA, there was a massive migration of millions of Latino people from the southern half of the Americas to the U.S. The demographics of whole regions of the country and industries changed as the consequence of the cultures and experiences of immigrants were added to and changed views and values of the society. Through these changes and struggles over the last 50 years, the introduction of women into the workforce, the mass movements against racism, sexism, and bigotry, and the migration of millions of workers from South America, Asia, and Africa, the composition of U.S. society has undergone a profound change. This has had the effect of creating a much more diverse society and put an end to the monolithic male single-wage earner family structure. All these changes, coupled with the struggles of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, have brought society to where it is today. The bourgeoisie, the ruling class, the 1%, the 1/10 of the 1%, trying to hold on to the centuries-old backward ideas promoted by the different ruling classes of the time against the material conditions and the values of the toiling masses. While all PSL members fight against anti-LGBT bigotry and for full rights for queer folk, We believe the discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people can never be fully eliminated under capitalism because the ruling class relies on it, along with racism and sexism, to help maintain their system. By denying full rights to LGBT people, the ruling class is able to subject queer workers to greater exploitation and garner greater profits. For example, by not recognizing our love, partners have no legal claim to Social Security survivor benefits. While health care for same-sex partners has been won, it is a right that could be taken back when the ruling class feels they have the opportunity to do so. There are over 1,100 federal benefits that opposite-sex married couples have, to which same-sex partners don't have a legal right. For example, I'm on my partner's health insurance. Because there is not federal recognition of same-sex marriage, the IRS views the money my partner company pays for my insurance as additional income for him. Therefore, he pays taxes on the same benefit that an opposite-sex married person does not. For binational same-sex couples, where one person is not a U.S. citizen, estimated about 80,000 couples in the U.S. Since there's no spousal recognition by ICE, these families, with an estimated 17,000 children, have no means of obtaining citizenship for their partners, as opposite-sex binational couples can. These couples and families live with the constant knowledge that the next knock on the door could lead to the separation of their families. Now, the ruling class also uses anti-LGBT bigotry in an equally important way as a tool to poison the working class with reactionary views about the community, to prevent unity and deflect the anger of the working class away from the 1% towards the LGBT community. While the bourgeoisie preaches freedom, democracy, and tolerance, its institutions validate just the opposite when it comes to racism, sexism, and anti-LGBT bigotry. That's why we know the names of Rodney King and Oscar Grant, or Matthew Shepard, a young gay man who was tortured and murdered by bigots in Laramie, Wyoming in 1998, or Sandra Fluke, the woman who called a slut by Rush Limbaugh for testifying in Congress about birth control. And at the same time, there are names you should know, like Cece McDonald. Cece McDonald is a male to female African-American transgender person who was convicted of second-degree murder and sent to a male prison for 41 months for defending herself from physical assault by a bigot. Cece, a college student in Minnesota, was out having a good time on June 5th, 2011 with her friends. As they were walking by a bar, 3 bigots verbally assaulted them with racist and homophobic language. One woman threw her glass at Cece, cutting her mouth and drawing blood. A fight ensued, and one of the bigots was stabbed and died. It may not be a coincidence that these bigots felt emboldened to attack a group of trans people in the same state where reactionary anti-LGBT initiatives have been put on the ballot in November. Now, we in the PSL say that only socialism can lay the basis for eliminating LGBT oppression and all forms of oppression. We say that not out of some romantic view or hope about socialism, but from the understanding that racism and sexism and anti-gay bigotry and all the forms of division have a material basis in capitalist system of exploitation that rewards the 1/10 of the 1% at the expense of the 99.9%. These divisions are constantly reinforced by the ruling class and all the institutions at its control. Socialism, a system based on meeting the needs of the 99%, has no need to divide the majority of society against itself. In fact, such divisions and the accompanying marginalization of LGBT folks or other oppressed groups is counter to socialism and the need for unity so that all members of society can be productive contributors to it. Having the material basis for eliminating anti-LGBT bigotry doesn't mean that the day after the revolution there'll be no bigotry or hatred even of gay people. The revolution inherits all the backward ideas, beliefs, and customs from the old order. It takes a conscious struggle to change people's views through education and struggle against those old ideas. Cuba is an excellent example of just such a process that is part of the socialist transformation of Cuban society around consciousness and understanding of LGBT issues. The Cuban Revolution triumphed in 1959, 10 years before Stonewall. Prior to the revolution, Cuba was a playground of the rich from the U.S., was a playground for the rich from the U.S. Casinos and drugs, prostitution were a manifestation of the colonial relationship with the United States. Racism, sexism, and anti-gay bigotry were very evident in Cuba. For example, Racism manifests itself in a law that banned all darker-skinned Cubans from public and private beaches on their island. Most Cuban women worked either as domestics for the rich or as prostitutes. And the most visible sectors of the LGBT community were sex workers who serviced the rich clientele from the U.S. After the revolution, many of the elements in Cuban society who were associated with the decadence of imperialist occupation were taken to re-education camps with the aim of helping them develop new and productive skills. This included the LGBT community, who were associated with this decadence of the overthrown system. The revolutionary leadership held an erroneous view that homosexuality was a bourgeois decadence, based on the prevailing views of the time both inside and outside the communist movement and around the world, and also reflected the material reality of Cuban life. This attitude led to hostility towards, instead of solidarity with, those very sectors of society who were victims of the old order. Now, the camps had a short life, and they would disband. As the revolution developed and the struggle against racism and sexism was carried out, attitudes towards women and gender roles underwent changes that positively affected views about homosexuality. The revolution was not unaffected by the global explosion of the LGBT liberation movement in the aftermath of Stonewall. In 1979, the new Cuban Penal Code decriminalized homosexual acts in private between consenting adults. In 1983, Cuba removed public acts of homosexuality as a crime. And during the 1980s, an educational campaign was carried out to combat homophobic views with books and materials aimed at social workers and psychologists as a way to lay the basis in the professional mental health and social work fields for the progressive changes to come. So this is being done by the state, the government. That's the big difference with socialism. It's doing it in the interest of the vast majority. In an interview published in 1992, then President Fidel Castro stated, "I don't consider homosexuality to be a phenomenon of degeneration. I consider it to be one of the natural aspects and tendencies of human beings which should be respected. I am absolutely opposed to any form of repression, contempt, scorn, or discrimination with regard to homosexuals." During the special period of the 1990s, after the overthrow of the USSR and the collapse of the socialist bloc, Cuba lost 80% of its trade. The ruling class was predicting the end of the revolution. The situation in Cuba was very bad. In 1994, the Cuban Film Institute made one film. It was entitled Fresas y Chocolate, or Strawberries and Chocolate. The film depicts the interaction between a gay Cuban man and a straight Communist Party member. The film shows a lack of understanding on the part of the Communist Party member and the contradictions that existed between his perceptions and the nature of the socialist reality in Cuba. Their friendship created a journey of understanding on the part of the party member in overcoming his views and provided for an evolution of his understanding. This film was a smash hit in Cuba. The run was extended over and over, and it was like, I don't think it was just because it was one of the few Cuban-made films, but it was something everyone wanted to see. Can anyone imagine a capitalist society in the midst of an 80% contraction of the economy conducting a cultural education campaign aimed at engendering solidarity between its people? It's far easier to imagine the ruling class carrying out a campaign to blame some vulnerable sector of the economy, of some vulnerable sector for the economic ills of society. I guess we don't really need to imagine that. Now recently, we were lucky enough to have an array of Cuban intellectuals visit the Bay Area. Included in the group was Mariela Castro, head of CENISEX, the National Center for Sex Education. She's a leading member of the Cuban Revolution. She happens to be the daughter of Raul Castro, the president. And she anchors Cuba's efforts at changing views on homosexuality and creating greater understanding and solidarity within Cuban society. We're now going to watch about 4 or 5 minutes of a short film. There was a reception for her and the other Cuban intellectuals, and she spoke for an extended period of time. It's going to be 4-minute sections, but she talks about, she's going to set it up. She spent the day with Cleve Jones and the Castro, and they went to a museum about Harvey Milk. And the part where she's talking kind of references, she's gone into the museum. And then
Y en el museo habían recuerdos desde los momentos iniciales que pudieron recoger información y te va viendo las distintas tendencias que iban predominando en la organización de este movimiento.
And through the museum, he talked to us about the history and how the neighborhood has evolved and different tendencies within the movement.
Y viendo esta historia, lo que he aprendido gracias al recurso metodológico del pensamiento marxista.
And I could put a lot of it in context thanks to having studied the methodology of Marxist thought.
Que todas las desigualdades tienen un origen económico.
Which is that all inequality has an economic origin.
Por eso yo promuevo que no luchemos solo contra una forma de desigualdad.
And that's why I exhort you all that we should not struggle against any one particular form of inequality.
Porque todas están estrechamente relacionadas.
Because all of them are intricately linked.
Si nos dividimos y creamos sectores, parcelas, no vamos a lograr transformación social.
And if we are divided, then we'll be like struggling as little separate units, and we will not achieve what we're fighting for.
Pude ver fotos donde se mezclaba en una misma persona la lucha por los derechos de los afrodescendientes, con consignas de los panteras negras, pero también por derechos de lesbianas y de mujer.
I could see their close relationship in this museum with the struggle for Black liberation and their historic connections to the Black Panther Party, for the visibility and inclusion of lesbians and connection to the women's movement and the women's struggle.
Pude ver la historia de los japoneses que en la Segunda Guerra Mundial fueron recluidos en campos de concentración porque tenían el dominio económico de la zona.
I saw about the history of the treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II and their exclusion, and they were put in concentration camps. Eso es lo que me faltaba. Because, and they were particularly targeted because they had, they ran the businesses in that community.
Y este japonés del que se resaltaba era gay. Hice fotos donde humanidad y diversidad estaba con su pareja.
And there was in the museum talked about a Japanese American who was gay and who was put in an internment camp together with his partner.
En fin, todas las discriminaciones están interseccionalizadas y así debemos trabajarlas.
So because all of the different forms of discrimination are so connected, we must, against them, is connected as well.
No tiene sentido que luchemos por los derechos LGBT y olvidemos los derechos de las mujeres, y olvidemos los derechos de los afrodescendientes, los derechos de los inmigrantes, en sentido general, los derechos de los pobres, porque las diferencias de clase lo marcan todo.
So I don't agree that we should, or I don't believe that we can really achieve the rights of the full rights of the LGBT community without taking into consideration African people's rights, women's rights, immigrants' rights, and also thinking about poor people's rights, because economics is a key factor in discrimination and injustice.
Bueno. Aprendí mucho y me llevo uno de los recuerdos más emocionantes de las calles de esta ciudad.
So it was a beautiful day today, and I will carry a deep memory, a wonderful memory with me in the streets of the city.
I think the example of Cuba shows what's possible when humanity is freed from the capitalist system that is based on exploitation and oppression, a system that breeds and reinforces hatred and violence against people based on differences. Imagine the accomplishments possible in the United States and around the world when the chains of human exploitation are broken and the bonds of human solidarity can be forged. There will be a time when we won't have to fight for marriage rights because there will be no rights associated with marriage. We will all have the same rights as human beings. People will join into consenting relationships based on mutual physical, intellectual, and emotional attractions, free of material needs. This is not a dream, it's socialism, it's what we're fighting for in the PSL. And this is, so it's not coercive. but it's educational. I mean, think of, instead of seeing ads for Burger King all the time, everywhere you go, you saw ads for sexual equality. And, you know, the President of the United States got up and didn't just say his personal feelings, but said, I'm going to fight for a law, and this is why, and kind of said what I just said. I mean, maybe, or parts of it, how that would impact people's consciousness when Raul or Fidel, or actually Bill Lesbian, who's the mother of Mariela Castro, she died recently, just recently. She was a leader of the Women's Federation, and has played a major role in the fight around women's equality and LGBT issues. So when the heroes of the revolution get up and raise these issues and have dialogue and conversation with the society, and when the societies, when people, I mean, there's not the kind of atomization, alienation that we have here. In '86, in '89, I went to Cuba as part of a Women's Service Brigade, and I went there, I was out and talked to lots of people, a lot of things going on. AIDS epidemic was in the throes of its worst times and so forth. And I developed a really good friendship with one of the Cubans, and you develop these really very deep bonds in a very short time because of that human solidarity that's so prevalent there. And I talked to a lot of people about my orientation. I was just kind of like, I don't want to be like, the gay American communist, I want to just be like a person on the trip. And I was talking to this guy, and he saw some reference to something I had, and he said, Saul, you married, you never talk about your wife or your partner. I said, no, I'm gay. And he stopped, he says, did you not tell me because you thought I would be, he was offended that I didn't tell him. He said, do you think I would be like, treat you badly? He said, we don't understand everything in Cuban society, but and this guy was someone who, he said he was not qualified to be a party member because he hadn't attained the right value, he hadn't struggled and all this, but he was like an average Cuban. And he said, in Cuba here, we look at everything through science, and when we see millions of people in motion fighting against some injustice, we have to analyze that. We can't dismiss that. So I want you to know, you should never think that in Cuba you can't say who you are and be who you are. And I think that reflects the community there. Now, in terms of what they're doing around the issue of LGBT issues, I say all that to set everything up. They had a campaign. They had like an anti-homophobia day, and it was basically like a Pride Day. And they started a few years ago. It was a day, it was in one place, and then it was a week, and then now it's like a month long. And they're actually talking about introducing into the national legislature, same-sex marriage. They're going to call it civil union. I mean, they're going to have the same rights as other Cubans, because you don't need to be married to have all the same rights, the economic rights that marriage is equated to here. So it's a question of struggling around people's consciousness. So everybody has health care, everybody has education, everybody has food, there's no evictions. So the struggle is about human solidarity and understanding past bigotry. So I think you can see, if you measure where Cuba was in '62, and where the U.S. was, and even though we've made enormous gains, the revolutionary process there is actually, it's moving very rapidly. So I think it's a testament to that debate. Having socialism there is the guiding force. In terms of the question you asked, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but Hussein, I'm sorry, about how is LGBT oppression a function of, relates to labor and exploitation of the ruling class. Well, I touched on it in some ways. Discrimination in a general way allows you to pay people less. I mean, racism, you look at the wages of communities of color. Same job, same classification, less pay. Women, same job, same experience, less pay. I think there's a similar parallel with LGBT folks. But as you saw in the video, the PSL video, you can be fired for being gay in 34 states in the U.S. There's no federal protection, or 28, and even more for being transgender. So if I express my gayness, I'm at risk of losing my job, not here in San Francisco and in California. So it puts me in a weaker position. right? So I can be further exploited because I'll be forced to do things that a straight worker wouldn't do because, you know, then I'd be fired for that. Plus, so there's that, and then I think the other aspect is pitting the working class against itself on that issue. We don't hear this phrase so much anymore, but it's like, how many times, I mean, it used to be like in some male-dominated jobs, like miners or something, you know, the foreman would say, you gotta go do that, and some guy would say, oh, it's dangerous, and the guy would say, what, you're not man enough, you a girl? You know, something worse, something like that. Using sexism to force, you know, the worker to do something that he knows she shouldn't do, and I think it's the same, so much in the same way that the ruling class tries to pit workers native-born workers who work with papers against undocumented workers and turn them against and say, fight them so we can further exploit both of you. I think LGBT oppression carries the same tool. It wasn't that long ago that you would be fired for being gay on the job. I mean, before the Stonewall Rebellion, this sounds prevalent, but you know, if they found out you were gay and you got arrested in a raid in a bar, and you spent the night in jail and you didn't come to work on Monday because the cops never let you out on time to get to work on Monday because they knew you have to explain why, they print your name in the paper, you lose your job. Well, that's not prevalent in society, but that kind of use of bigotry enables greater exploitation. And I think I mentioned, and maybe I ran through the numbers too quickly, but there's also just economic benefits that that LGBT community doesn't have. Transgender people, I mean, there's a lot of topics to talk about. Youth and transgender people, the poverty level for transgender people is like 8 times the national average. Maybe it's not 8. I read it. I don't remember the number, but because it's a vulnerable sector of society. Whenever you have a more vulnerable sector of society, you can always use them against, you know, the rest of the working class. So it's the question of fighting for solidarity is the way to actually improve the quality of life of everybody. So if you can, you know, it used to be in the South, you know, one of the great labor struggles was over racism. So, you know, there would be white workers with backward ideas go on strike. The bosses who were more racist than those workers didn't take a second to bust in black workers to break the strike. What's the way to resolve that? Is to fight for racial solidarity and have those black workers stand on the picket line and fight for them to have jobs. So that's the use of anti-gay bigotry. We don't see it here, you know, in San Francisco, California, you know, but I mean, it's not institutional. It may happen, but the institutions of society apologize for it. But it's still part of that infrastructure. I mean, how can you have someone like C.C. McDonald in a society? It's like she defended herself against his bigots, and she's in jail. The bigot actually had. I mean, the bigot was like he's a Nazi. He's got a whole history of violence and stuff, and he's just. I mean, actually, that guy was got killed, but his friends, you know, have that same past. So, and think, Les, you asked me about just kind of the impact of. I mean, I don't know about individuals in Cuba, individuals from outside of Cuba having an influence. I mean, I think the Cubans are internationalists in their view about the world. They see themselves as contributing to the world struggle, but they also see themselves learning from the world struggle. And I think one thing they did, I was trying to find the information, but in the 1980s, I believe, so let me a little background. In East Germany, the Socialist Party of Germany, there was great progress made on this question of LGBT liberation. And they had a lot of experts and kind of people kind of like Mariela Castro. So, well, one of them, I can't remember her name, and someone may remember, came to Cuba and helped kind of establish the Senesex Center. And she actually helped write and translate this book that I talked about that they distributed to the social workers and psychologists to combat the backward ideas that were prevalent in society. So I think that, like the story I told about the Cuban I met, I mean, that's one Cuban amongst 11 million, maybe it wasn't 11 million then, and I think that's the same that the Cuban revolutionary process's leaders looked just like. They look at the world from the point of view of scientific socialism. You know, this struggle, what are we learning about this? How do we fight on this question? Fidel, you know, I think it was mentioned, maybe it wasn't tonight, but there was I think, I'm trying to mention, the first transgender operation in Cuba was in 1989. That was the film that we talked about earlier. You know, and Fidel engaged her and sent flowers and like took part in that struggle, you know, to extend solidarity. You know, and Mariela Castro tells the story of talking to her uncle, Fidel, when she spoke at the LGBT Community Center about his own process in understanding the question of transgender people. And it was really interesting. She explained that he asked the question when she came to talk about this question. He says, "Isn't it kind of crazy?" She's quoting. This is her quote. "Isn't it kind of crazy for someone to want to change their genitals?" This is her father, Fidel Franco, asking her. And she came back and said, "Well, there's a lot of science about, you know, understanding people's desire to change their gender identity and everything." And Fidel is a communist. He's a Marxist. It's a science. You look at things from the point of materialism and dialectics, meaning you look at what's really going on here, not not, you know, mysticism and so forth. And she used that for him to understand the question. And that all came from her process of being involved with her mother, and her mother actually being a fighter for equality. And this was all part of their own internal process and learning from the struggle around the world. I mean, you know, Stonewall changed everything. I mean, I've been in the political movement a long time, and I've gone to many a revolutionary meeting where, you know, people didn't use backward racist terms, but they certainly used backward anti-gay terms until people got up and said, "You know what, stop saying that shit. I don't want to hear it anymore. I'm sick of this. You know what you're saying?" And they go, "What do you mean?" It's like, "Oh, I never realized."